takes that a few steps further. And it'll use what we call signals, which is just information on the users and the device that they're signing in from. Sort of interpret those signals based on how your policies are configured to allow access, deny access, give limited access. So it's very intelligent. We have very granular control over how we can allow certain users or certain groups access to different apps and different data. In conditional access, there's a few places we can manage it from actually. The Entra portal is one of those. You can do it directly from the Azure dashboard through Azure AD, and we can also access it from the Intune portal. Next slide. So who should use conditional access? Honestly, everyone should be using it, especially if you're licensed for it. Microsoft does have an option that gives you a little bit of protection if you aren't licensed for that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But as we mentioned, you need a minimum of a P1 license. And really, the reason you shouldn't do it is because or should always use it. If you're not, is because you can always set just some foundational best practice policies. MFA, the recommended way to use MFA is through conditional access, blocking legacy authentication, and then blocking sign-ins just from countries where you'll never do business. So, for example, if you're a US based company and you have no connections to Russia or any foreign country for that matter, sign-ins should never be coming there. You can block those with conditional access. And if you don't have a P1 license, if you have a business basic or a business standard, for example, Microsoft allows you, by default, they have what they call Azure AD security defaults turned on, and they'll give you a good foundation of protection. It'll require all users to register for MFA, require admins to use MFA. It blocks legacy authentication. So it's a good foundation, but you lack that granular control that you get with conditional access policies. Next slide. Okay, so this slide's a little busy, and I hope you guys can see the screenshots I did. If not, I can maybe zoom those in or post them later. But anyway, this is what we're looking at in terms of licensing. So if we look at from left to right, where it starts with Azure ADP1, that's what the minimum requirement that you need to use conditional access. It contains most signals and most features. And the reason I say most is because everything to the right of it, you don't get unless you have that higher tier of license. So some of the basic things you can do with Azure ADP1, you can, location-based access. Um, you can still use session controls. You can allow or block compliant devices, those sorts of things. As soon as we upgrade to a P2, the big thing that you get is risk-based sign-ins. So what is a risk-based sign-in? This is sort of a rabbit hole in itself, so we're not going to go too far into this, but um, it uses Azure AD Identity Protection, and it uses that engine to determine the risk level of a user. And based on that risk level, you can do certain things like block the sign-in attempt, allow the sign-in attempt, or have them remediate or increase assurance. Um, so the two types of risk-based sign-ins are user-based risk, and that would basically be if a user's credentials were leaked on the dark web or were found online somewhere. Um, and then the next one would be a sign-in risk. Sign-in risk is going to use different information based on when you usually sign in, where are you coming from, what types of devices are you using, and then it sort of compiles that and determines a risk factor for your sign-ins. And a good example of this would be atypical travel. So, if I'm always signing in from around Chicagoland and then an hour later I'm signing in from London, it's going to flag that as a risky sign in. And you can do, however you want to deal with that. You can block the sign in, require a phishing resistant MFA or something like that. So that's sort of what you get with the P2 with risk based sign ins. Um, Defender for Cloud Apps will give you conditional access for app control. Okay, this is the big idea behind this is to monitor and control aspects of users' sessions once they're authenticated to a cloud app. The focus is really about preventing unauthorized data exfiltration. So, one example, an easy example for here would be preventing users from downloading data from SharePoint or OneDrive. So that's what you would get with the Defender for Cloud Apps add-in. And then lastly, we have Entra for Workload Identities Premium. And this allows you to use conditional access against service principals. So, for example, an app registration in Azure. And right now, this is fairly limited. You can block and allow based on location. And then there's also service principal risk that's similar to the risk based sign ins that we get with the Azure ADP2 license. So, next slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Jesus at this point.
Cool. So, hey again, my name is Jesus Morales. So, there's a few things that I'd like to sort of point out when it comes to conditional access. There's a bunch of components with conditional access, just a little bit of history of conditional access. So you can do a lot of things with conditional access. There's a lot of buttons. There's a lot of components and features, and not every single button is required to be filled in with something. Depending on what you're actually building out or what your business requirements are, there's different ways to use conditional access. So the way I like to think of conditional access, think of it as you're sort of building out this story, this scenario. And then once you built that scenario, or you told this story that you're building on this policy, then you decide the behavior. And that's where the if and then statement sort of topic comes into hand, right? So you're kind of beginning with selecting your users or your groups in some examples, and you're deciding behavior on what happens when these users access these applications, maybe through certain devices, through the modern client, or through the browser, through whether it's through one type of platform, whether it's iOS or Android or Windows. There's different ways to create a conditional access policy. And in the next few slides, I'd like to dig in a little bit more on how we can use conditional access to help us when we're using things like Intune MDM, for example, or app protection policies. So again, if the assignments and conditions of the policy are met, then you either grant, or you block, or remediate, or require increased assurance. So depending on what statement you've created, you can essentially then grant or decide the behavior of that specific scenario. So going over to the next slide. So for this example, so for those that are using, let's say, Intune MDM, you can use conditional access to require and force your users to enroll. So in this demo, so I recorded this a few days ago, but in endpoint.microsoft.com, there's different ways of accessing your conditional access. So within Intune, in the same place you go and do MDM stuff, we actually have a shortcut for conditional access there. So if you go down to the bottom, you'll see conditional access. And today we're going to create a quick conditional access policy to require users to enroll their device into MDM, and in this case, Intune MDM. So we're going to go ahead and create a new policy. Since a year down the road or several months down the road, I mean, it's very possible to have more than one conditional access policy. So I like to name them something very obvious. So in this case, I named it require device compliance. And in parentheses, I went ahead and put Intune MDM enrollment for iOS and Android. You can create a separate one for Windows. You can divide up your iOS ones, with the separate Android one. But I like to combine the mobile. In this example, I'm going to combine the mobile platforms. So back to what I mentioned earlier about sort of establishing that story, we can go ahead and select the users. And in this example, I'm just going to use one user. You can do this for testing. Nobody really jumps in and selects all users most of the time. So we're pretty much building a story to say when this user accesses this specific application, and in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to select Office 365. You do see the all cloud apps option. Very rarely do you select all cloud apps. Just remember the list that you see here on the right in cloud apps, when you select every single cloud app individually, it's not the same thing as all cloud apps. There's a lot of hidden services and engines. There's a lot of different things that maybe you might not be too familiar with. All cloud apps can mean something very, very different at one company versus a completely different company. So just be very careful about using all cloud apps. But in this case, we're going to use the Office 365 as an example. So far, we've only done two things. We selected our users, and we selected the cloud apps, in this case, Office 365. So think of it as when these users that we selected access Office 365, and now we're going to choose the conditions. Go to the next little slide here. So we selected Office 365. So when these users access Office 365 from an Android device and an iOS device. We can leave the other ones blank. From any location, we want this rule to work, whether it's at a Starbucks, whether it's in the in the office, whether it's at home Wi-Fi. So when we're saying when these users access Office 365 from an iOS and Android using a browser, a mobile app, or any of these methods, we're going to go ahead and decide the behavior of what happens when these users access Office 365 using those methods. And in this case, we want to be able to grant access as long as the device is marked as compliant. In order for these devices to be marked as compliant, it has to come from Intune MDM in this example. So required device to be marked as compliant, the user will essentially only be able to access those cloud apps, in this case, Outlook, for example, or SharePoint, or any of the applications that are accessing Office 365, using a device that's marked as compliant. And in order to be compliant, again, it has to be Intune MDM enrolled. So we can use this as an example to enroll maybe certain parts of the organization or every single user in the organization. If you're using Intune MDM, this is actually a great way of getting your users to enroll into Intune MDM, because sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we have a product like Intune MDM and we just have to kind of ask our users to enroll, but it requires effort from the user to go through the company portal and enroll their device. But when you're using things like conditional access, it really kind of helps nudge the users again, because when you have this rule set up, you have to remember that when you're targeting a user, and let's say they're using Outlook already, as soon as you kick this on, think of this as the hammer, where you're kind of coming down and forcing the user to be marked as compliant in order to continue having access to those services. So if they don't enroll, they would essentially be blocked. So it is a very, very, very powerful tool. And definitely I encourage you to use conditional access to your advantage in these types of scenarios. So that's one example of how to use conditional access when you want to require MDM enrollment. So even though we have listed here required device to be marked as compliant, we're essentially requiring that device to be MDM enrolled. So this was one quick example using the iOS and Android platform. You can create an identical conditional access policy, maybe name it something like, require MDM enrollment for Windows, and just change the platform around. So now we're going to quickly create a separate one. So this is another way of using conditional access where you can require app protection policies. So you can see here in the demo, this is a previous one we already created. I have it turned off. This is the one that's going to require MDM enrollment. This next one that we're going to create, when we're building it out, it's going to be very identical to what we already created with this first one. The only difference and the only thing that's going to change with this policy is the grant control. So we're going to run through the exact same thing. We're going to choose our user or our user groups. I recommend starting small, then slowly adding users to a group, or just selecting more groups as you expand this policy. And what's going to happen here is we're going to choose our conditions after selecting Office 365 as we did earlier. Same thing as we did in the previous policy. So once we get over to conditions, we're going to choose the exact same thing. We're going to go over to device platforms. Again, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of buttons. And for this example, we don't need to use things like user risk or sign-in risk. It's just for this specific combination, it's not necessary. So again, we're jumping straight over to device platforms where we're going to decide behavior for users accessing Office 365 on an Android and iOS device. I'm going to quickly go over to locations. We want this behavior everywhere. We're going to choose the same client apps. Now, again, identical to the previous one, everything was identical except when we get over to grant, instead of choosing require the device to be marked as compliant, we're actually going to choose require app protection policy. So if your organization is using Intune MDM, you can create a conditional access policy like we did earlier for a certain part of the organization, maybe some groups, maybe some folks in the field, or maybe some folks that are accessing very sensitive data and you want that device to be enrolled, so you can maybe do a wipe and things like that. Now, when we're doing this conditional access policy, this is for those that are using Intune app protection policies. The same users that you targeted to force the device to be enrolled, you can target them for this exact same policy as well. But what this policy is going to do is for that user to access Office 365. In this case, let's say they're going to access the Exchange Online service, which is included in that targeted app that we selected. What this is going to do is going to make sure that in order for that user to access mail, for example, it has to come from an application that has the Intune app protection policy deployed to. So when you're using Intune app protection policies, which are the policies to prevent things like cut and copy and paste from, an Outlook over to Facebook, for example, or any of these MAM policies, this is essentially going to be used as a mechanism to ensure that only the applications that are being protected by MAM are the ones that can be used to access those those corporate resources. So this is another common way of using conditional access. It's identical. The only thing that changed is actually in the grants control. Same exact behavior. We're just deciding the behavior at the very, very end to be a little bit different. So let's say you deploy both of these policies to the same group of users. Well, what's going to happen there is that the user would, in order to access, let's say, mail on their device, on an iOS and Android, they would have to be coming from a device that's not only Intune MDM enrolled, but the mechanism to access mail has to be through Outlook that's protected by a MAM policy, or in this case, Intune app protection policies. So these are two common examples on how we can use that. We also have some templates online. Whenever you guys get access to these slides, I put in a link on accessing some templates. So in case you're using conditional access for the first time, this is a good starting point. The other two policies that I just showed, those are also really good starting points if you're using conditional access for your devices. So when is conditional access evaluated? So since you target the identity, the way you have to think about this is when that token expires. Let's say you have users already that are using Outlook on their mobile devices like iOS and Android, and IT suddenly enables conditional access in the same form that I just described earlier. When a user signs into Outlook, or if they're already using Outlook and that token essentially expires, that authentication cannot be renewed if it doesn't meet the requirements of conditional access. So this is a very, very useful tool to use in a variety of scenarios. And with that, I might have ran through this pretty quickly, but Gannon, I'm not sure if you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the what if components on evaluating conditional access.
Yeah. So I'll talk to the slide for just a minute,
Yep.
and then I will jump over to demo and sort of show you guys how this works. We'll take a look at some other things regarding conditional access, but one of the best tools that we've got at our disposal for conditional access is the what if tool. And if you've been using conditional access for a while, I'm sure you're familiar with this. If you're just starting out, definitely take advantage of it. This basically allows you to set certain conditions, choose a user, choose a device platform that they're using, a location if you want to say they're signing in from a specific location, and which app they would be accessing, and put that all into this tool. And then there's a button that says "What if," and you click it, and it'll run through and evaluate all the conditional access policies you have and show you which ones apply to the user based on those conditions, which ones don't, if the policy is in report only mode, if it's on or if it's off. So if Angel or Florian, if you can switch it over so it's sharing my screen, I can demonstrate this. There we go. Okay, so this is just a lab environment here. In this situation, I'm using Entra to get to the conditional access policies. But if at the very top here, you see this what if button. So if we click it, this is where we can start to add our conditions. All right, so I'm going to pick my favorite test user, Mick Foley, and I'll leave this for now. I'm going to pick just Office 365, and we can sort of play with this and show you guys how it can change based on our certain policies. All right, an IP address is required. We're just going to fill in and you need to choose a country. So this is the minimum that you need to actually run the what if tool. So if I actually click the button, okay, here's where we're going to see policies that will apply. It's going to show us these um, policies that will not apply. Okay, and it will tell you why they're not going to apply. In this case, Mick Foley's not an admin. Okay, so he's not going to be part of this policy. He's also not signing in from a location that I have blocked. So this is an example of why it's not going to apply. On the right here under state, we can see if the policies are on or if they're in report only. This is sort of important because if it's in report only, it's going to report in the sign-in logs, and I'll show you that in just a minute, but it's not actually going to enforce and take action. Okay, so if we did change this, I have a policy set up that will demonstrate that requires a specific authentication strength to access Microsoft Teams. So right here, we just have regular multi-factor authentication. Okay, so if we were to go to portal.office.com, sign in as Mick Foley, we're going to get an MFA challenge. He's going to satisfy that. But if we remove this and now select Teams and run through this what if tool again, now we have an additional policy here, phishing resistant MFA for Teams, because now the app that we're trying to access has a policy applied directly against it. One other thing that we can do with conditional access policies is add filters. So if we were to change the device to be marked as compliant, I have a filter for a certain policy on this. Now we lose a policy here. So this is where you can really evaluate what you have. If you work at an MSP and you come into a tenant that just has a slew of conditional access policies, this can be useful when you're trying to figure out what they're all doing. One other thing that I'll talk about really quick, I'll pop into one of these, is where to turn them on, report only or off. That's at the bottom. That's important to know. And then let's just talk about this policy real quick, block non-compliant devices. This is a fairly common policy that some organizations want. Okay, they don't want people accessing their corporate data from a personal Windows device or a personal computer. They want it to be Intune enrolled. They want it to be marked as compliant because then they know all of their software is on it. It's abiding by their security policies, etc. So if we look at this one, this policy that I have is just require the device to be marked as compliant or be hybrid Azure AD joined. Okay, and we have it set to any device. You can exclude specific devices here. So in this case, we just have it for Windows. But the important thing is it's in report only. Okay, so how do we see if policies are actually applying or not? For example, you may have a user that is having an issue accessing something. How do you troubleshoot that to see if conditional access is the culprit? Um, what we want to look at is the sign-in logs. Okay, that's where I usually start. You can get to them from Azure AD, or you can get to them from conditional access over here under sign-in logs. I'm going to switch tabs because I have this filtered. This isn't my IP. I was using a VPN when I did this. But this is where you can evaluate. Okay, you have a conditional access column here, and we see a whole bunch of successes, and then we see a couple failures. So those would be something you want to look at. If we did try to access this tenant from a non-compliant device, uh, you're still going to have access since we're in report only. And if we select one of these specific sign-in logs, okay, we get additional details here. All right, so basic info, that's going to show some sensitive info, your tenant ID and some other things. So I'm not going to click that here, but that's sort of an overview of how the authentication happened. If we go to locations, here we can see the IP. Okay, so if you're using location-based conditional access, you can come here to see where this sign-in was taking place. In this case, this is a non-managed, non-compliant device. Okay, and if we go to conditional access, we can see the policies that are actually enforced and if they were successful or not. And if we click the report only tab, here we can see if this policy was turned on, it would fail. But since it's in report only, okay, we're just gonna it's still going to allow it, but it's going to log it so you can see what would have happened when you turn it on. As opposed to, I flipped over to a different tab. This device is a managed compliant device. Okay, this one, it's showing that this one would succeed. Okay, so that's how you can use some of these sign-in logs just to kind of evaluate what is going on if someone is having trouble signing in. Um, and let's talk about another policy. Let's just sort of demonstrate how some of these work when we were talking about when conditional access is evaluated. So I'm going to pull up my trusty test machine. All right, and we're going to sign in as Mick Foley. Hopefully. There we go. All right. Okay, and here's our regular MFA challenge. All right, so now we're signed in. The authentication logs are usually lagging behind by around 10 minutes. So I'm not going to be able to show you this exact one, but I generated some traffic, okay, just to show you. Is this the Teams one? Oh, I'm sorry, here it is. Just to show you what would have happened or what will be generated based on that event. So here we're signing into Office 365. Here's our sign-in log. We can see MFA was satisfied, okay, and we can see the multi-factor authentication conditional access policy here. Now, if we open this back up and say, okay, now I want to go to Teams. We're trying to prove authentication here because we previously authenticated, but conditional access is reevaluating and saying, okay, for this, you need to actually use specific authentication strength. In this case, phishing resistant authentication strength. I'm not going to proceed with this because this is a VM, but I've got a hardware token. And this is the sign-in log that you will see as a result of that. We can see we're signing into the Teams web client. Okay, and now under authentication details, we can see a FIDO2 security key was used, and it was successful. If we click conditional access, now we can see CA07, phishing resistant MFA for Teams, was successful. And you can click on these and actually look at the details. Okay, so here we see Mick Foley was our user. That matches the policy. The Teams web app matches this policy. Um, it gives us some more information here that we don't have configured, and then the grant control for phishing resistant MFA was satisfied. So that's an example of how it's evaluated for specific apps. Okay, if you're requiring different authentication strengths or different requirements to access certain applications. And I think we have time just for one more quick one. Okay, we can look at one of these more advanced policies that comes with a Defender for Cloud Apps add-on, to where we can block downloads from OneDrive. Okay, so for my policy, let me flip back over here. I have this applied to unmanaged Windows and Mac devices. And I have a filter here that says if the device is marked as compliant, exclude it from the policy. Okay, so we're going to do this from an unmanaged device. All right, so we're already signed in as Mick Foley here. I'm going to cancel this. Okay, and now if I select OneDrive, and this would also work for SharePoint, you're going to see this screen. Hey, your session's being monitored. Okay, that's the whole idea behind Defender for Cloud Apps and conditional access app control. So we're going to continue anyway, but it's warning the user that your activity is being monitored. Okay, and let's just say, I think I have a file here. Yep, let's try to download install.ps1, and it's going to block us. Okay, so one interesting thing about this policy is if we go back over to our authentication logs, we can see that it successfully applied this CA block downloads for unmanaged devices when we authenticated. But we can't see here where it was logging that the user tried to download a file. So for that, we actually, and this is getting a little bit outside of the scope, but since we looked at this part, I'm going to show you just real quick where um, you can see those logs to see that somebody tried to download something. And it's actually in defender.microsoft.com. So it's in the Defender portal. You go down to settings here, and then you scroll down to conditional access app control. Um, and here you can see all of the apps that are connected. All right, so I'm going to select OneDrive for Business, and I'm going to scroll this up to hide some of the previous log entries. But this overview page doesn't give you a ton of information, just some basic activity or active users. But if you click activity log, okay, and this log updates a lot quicker than the sign-in logs, because we can see here at 10:34, which was less than a minute ago, um, Mick Foley tried to download this file from this IP and it blocked him. So that's where you can get those granular details on this. So that is, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up the demo at this point, after showing you guys that stuff. And I guess we'll take a few questions after this. Otherwise, you guys can leave them in the comments, but I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Florian at this point.
Perfect. Thanks, Gannon. Thanks, Jesus, for the great insights, for all the details you showed us, for the great demos we've had. Yeah, as Gannon said, we have time for some questions. I already saw that Jacob wrote one, which Jesus was able to answer. If there are any other questions, feel free to leave it in the comments of the LinkedIn event. Also, if some question come in mind later, just write it down. We will be able to answer them today or tomorrow if they come. Yeah, if there are no questions left, before we end today's webinar, I would like to take another chance to tell you about our upcoming webinar, about our upcoming in-person summit in Paris. For that, we have a short video, and if you want to book tickets and want to see which speakers we have already announced, you will find the link in the comments as well. And with that, I thank you everyone for watching this webinar. Enjoy the video, have a good one, and most important, hopefully see you in Paris.